Yes, hello once again, and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, but more especially, welcome to the 2023 Helsington Classic Scramble. Okay, so thanks once again for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV as we continue our Paddock walkabout at the 2023 Helsington World Sport Taylor Trophy Scramble. And in this part 2 video, we're going to kick off by taking a look at a very rare bike indeed. And this featured machine here is Graham Watson's 1973 Shenny Triumph 200. Now this lovely little Shenny framed Triumph Tiger Cub 200 is said to be one of only 3 cantilever prototype frames that were designed by the great Eric Shenny a way back in the 1970s. So the particular story and history of this very rare bike is as varied as it is complex, and so I intend to do a much more in-depth and full feature on this really interesting machine at a later date here on my channel. But for now, we'll make do with this very brief introduction. But basically, the bike's chassis was originally designed by Eric Shenny in the 1970s as a cantilever type of setup that was to use a conventional pair of twin-shock suspension units that were mounted underneath the bike's seat. Now, it's quite well documented that only 3 of these very unique chassis were ever built by Eric Shenny, but whatever became of the remaining 2 frames is anybody's guess. But even so, this is still a very rare and unique little bike. Now, the motor that powers our mini racer is a Triumph Tiger Cub 200cc 4-stroke power plant, but this particular engine here is fitted with a very unique cylinder that was designed and manufactured by Graham's dad way back in the 1970s. But as I mentioned, the story and history of this little bike is quite a nice family tale, and I'm quite looking forward to sharing it all with my YouTube channel viewers, but for the purposes of this Paddock walkabout, we'll confine our information to the very basic of details so that we can tell the full story later on. But the bike is made up from various bits and pieces of other kinds of motorcycles, and it was Graham's dad who did all of the spanner work and the engineering on this bike, so that his son Graham could have a bike that he could race against the many Japanese 2-strokers that were dominating schoolboy scrambling events in the UK in the early 1970s. But as I said, we'll keep all of the details about the bike and its history so that we can put together a more in-depth feature at a later date. So as I said, I'm looking forward to telling the tale of this very rare and unique bike. So for the time being, that's Graham Watson's lovely cantilever Shenny Triumph. And so this was another quite nice looking bike that I came across on my walkabout around the paddock. A quite nice looking 1972 Maiko MC 250, another rare German beastie that you certainly don't see every day at these kind of classic scramble race events, especially one of these older square barrel models, because usually bikes like these are normally hidden away in museums or maybe private bike collections as antique motorcycle specimens, and this I must say is the very first time I've ever seen one in the flesh about to take part in a motocross race meeting. So well done to the owner of the bike for keeping it out there on the racetrack. Now, I do remember that the owner of this bike on the day did tell me that he does all of the engineering work on this bike just to keep it racing, and he said it is a bit of a headache, especially when it comes to the engine and keeping it going with regards replacing worn out parts, because engine components are like gold dust to find for these older square barrel bikes, so he's had to end up making his own motor parts just to keep the bike on the track. And as I said, a very rare sight to see one of these square barrel bikes at a classic scramble nowadays, and these square barrel motors were of course just before Maiko then changed to the more popular radial finned engines that we are now more familiar with. And again, no surprise that the owners fitted a more modern pair of Maxton suspension units onto the rear of our Maiko, which is of course what you'd expect to happen on a 50 plus year old dirt bike. Now, Maikos at this time still had this familiar underslung exhaust in the early 1970s, but of course this is a replacement pipe, which once again is all due to the age of the machine. But certainly it still looks like the stock original steel Maiko swing arm, which looks like it's been drilled with holes just to remove any excess and unwanted weight. But certainly no mistaking this 1970 style alloy Maiko fuel tank, which of course was a bit of a Maiko trademark for its day. But without doubt, it's still great to see not only one of these old Maikos in the flesh again, but to see one getting prepped to go back out onto the track. And hopefully this is another bike that we'll catch a glimpse of when we get down to posting all of the racing action from this Helsington event. So look out for that coming very soon. Okay, so next up we have a nice Spanish Montessor, and this example here is Paul Armour's 1980 414 Capra VF. And at the risk of continually repeating myself, another one of those elusive European machines that you very seldom see trackside here in the UK, although I do believe that these are still very popular bikes over there in their native Spain. Although as a younger man back in the late 1970s and early 80s, bikes like these Montessors and Bultacos and even the Ossas were the staple diet for a lot of young riders who raced in the UK at that time. But then of course the might of the massive Japanese bike builders of Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha and Suzuki then began flooding the UK market with their faster and better engineered motocrossers, which of course led to the riders flogging their European race bikes so that they could then buy the latest Red Rocket or RM Suzuki from Japan. But that's not to say that our Montessor was a bad bike, because these machines could still compete well enough on the racetrack, but the writing was definitely on the wall as the years progressed, and most of our UK motocross market would then be dominated by the big four Japanese companies. But I still certainly recognise this bike, and I'm pretty sure that this machine's been in Paul's possession ever since he bought it brand new from Harrison's motorcycle shop in Sedberg in Cumbria in 1980, when I'm pretty sure that Paul told me that he handed over £1,200 for this bike when he spied it sitting in Harrison's shop window. And there was another story of the bike being caught up in a flood in Paul's workshop, where the bike, he said, was lying under 6 feet of water and it had to be completely stripped down and then rebuilt. But it's great to run into this bike once again and to see it back out there on the racetrack. But it's still good to see that Paul's kept the faith with his old Montessor after all these years. Okay, so next up on our list of Paddock bikes is Martin Stokes' 1981 Yamaha YZ125. And this bike here is one of the more modern liquid-cooled versions of the awesome YZ125, which I'm sure they designated the YZ125H back in 1981. Now, if my old aging memory serves me correctly, these liquid-cooled YZs had a small radiator that was bolted just in front of the bike's headstock, just behind that little cowling that was fitted onto the front of the bike, and it used parts of the frame and the bike's headstock to channel the coolant around the motor. But certainly what a machine these bikes were back in the day, and even now here in 2023 they're still very highly competitive in the smaller 125 class. And this liquid cooled 125 engine was certainly a little belter, which even although it has no kind of cooling fins, it still looks even smaller than its older 125 air-cooled counterpart. But they say that great things come in little packages, and that statement is certainly true in this case, because if you could keep this little motor buzzing in that mid-range and dance up and down on that 6-speed gearbox, then this little package could certainly hustle you around the racetrack. But at the back end of our YZ, it was your stock Yamaha single monoshock, and of course Yamaha's monocross swing arm there as well. And at the front it was Yamaha's 38mm forks, which for a small 125 certainly worked very well, and I think they gave the rider about 11 inches of travel here at this front end. But Martin was racing two bikes in two different 125 classes on the day, and he was alternating between this YZ125 and his CR125 Honda as well. But another lovely looking little YZ. Now, as I mentioned before, the Helsington Scramble was certainly awash with 125s on the day, and this next example here is David Ellis's 1980 YZ125, which is another fine example of one of these Yamahas, and it's not that unreasonable to know why these are so popular in the 125 class, because they were such a great handling little bike with a good strong flickable chassis, and of course good suspension on the front and at the rear. But it's the air-cooled version on these YZs this time, because I think this was the last year of the air-cooled 125s before Yamaha then switched to the liquid-cooled model of the likes of Martin's that we've just had a look at previously. But again, another compact reed valve induction motor that was both powerful and very reliable. But once more, your stock Yamaha forks, and David, it looks like he's fitted a pair of fork socks as well on his suspension at the front to just try and keep dust, dirt and moisture out of those delicate fork seals. But for sure, yet another fine looking example of one of these iconic 1980 YZ125s from David Ellis. Now, parked right beside David's bike was this other 1980 YZ belonging to Stephen Riley, so I thought that we'd just give Stephen's YZ the once over in the passing. Now, if you're a fan of these types of Yamahas and the 125s in particular, then there were plenty of these bikes to see at this year's Helsington Scramble, because as I said, we had two classes for these little buzz bombs with the Twin Shock A and the Twin Shock B classes, which of course these monoshock Yamahas are still eligible to race in due to the fact of their rear suspension not having any types of linkages, and of course they still have drum brakes on the front and at the rear, and of course more importantly an air-cooled engine. And without doubt we could certainly have spent hours filming all of the 125s that were at this Helsington Scramble over the weekend, and possibly even made up a 2-hour feature on these models alone because of the numbers that were scattered around the paddock. But having said that, there were some very nice and rare bikes on display, and this machine here of Stephen Riley's was yet another one of the immaculately prepared Yamahas that were getting ready to rip up the Helsington racetrack. Now, there were a couple of nice Czechoslovakian CZ twin porters that I was drawn towards as I walked around the paddock, and this beautiful 1965 CZ 250 twin porter belonged to Jeff Taylor, and although again Jeff's bike's maybe not a stock original machine from 1965, it's still a stunning looking version of one of these world-class Czechoslovakian two-stroke racers. Powered, as you know, by this single-cylinder twin-port two-stroke CZ engine, and it looks like Jeff's ditched the old Chekhov carburetor in favour of a much more modern Mikuni replacement. But even for 1965, what a motor these twin porters were. They were quite light, reasonably reliable, and of course very quick, which is why some of the top riders in the world cut their teeth on these old twin porters. And it's also said that the legendary Joël Robert used to jam the heel of his boot into this clutch operating arm to hold the clutch in when they used to do the old one hand on your helmet starts way back in the 1960s. Although make no mistake, even here in 2023, these antique CZ racers are still very competitive in the 250 class. Okay, they have much better suspension now than the basic factory parts they had in 1965, but even so, with the right rider in the driving seat, these bikes could beat much of the competition of its day. And if you were ever to come up behind one of these twin porters and you see these two exhausts sticking out the back, then there's no question about what make and model of machine that you're chasing. But it's certainly great to see one of these old twin porters once again looking so good. And not only that, this example here is still being used on the track as a classic racer. So as I mentioned, there were two examples of these old twin porters parked together, and this next bike here is Andy Hinchcliffe's 360 twin port CZ, the bigger brother of course of the 250 that we've just had a look at. But when I eventually get around to posting the racing from this Helsington Scramble, if there is one rider and one bike that you have to look out for, then it's Andy Hinchcliffe on this 360, because he was just simply awesome on the day, and he could certainly make this bike fly, although then again it should be quite easy to spot him on the track, because he'll be the guy out in front leading the rest of the chasing pack, a merry dance around that Helsington racetrack. And as you can see once more, a single cylinder two-stroke with these twin exhaust ports and pipes, which back in the day would have been more or less flat and almost parallel with the swing arm and not stuck up in the air as we see here. But it still looks like Andy has the stock original CZ front suspension on his bike, which for that 1960s era wasn't too bad in terms of the performance on the track, and for the brakes, these CZ old school drums were certainly surprisingly good considering their design. Although without doubt this is certainly a bike and a rider to watch out for on the track in the forthcoming racing highlights, which when you see it, it'll just give you a good idea of just how fast and competitive these antique two-strokers were back in those golden days of the legendary 1960s. Now you can also see Andy Hinchcliffe taking part in the pre-1974 class when he'll be riding this very nice CR250 Honda Elsinore, the bike of course that brought motocross to the masses in that year. And if there was ever a motorcycle that changed the face of off-road riding for the better, then these little Elsies certainly deserve their place in the history books, because when Honda unveiled these bikes to the world, which I think was in 1973, it seemed that everybody just wanted one, and Honda were actually selling them before they'd even made them. And these little Elsies were still classed, of course, as Honda's very first production motocross machine, because many of the so-called off-roaders that Honda made prior to the Elsinore were basically just road bikes modified for use as trail or scrambles machines. Now the Elsies were powered by this single-cylinder two-stroke piston port 5-speed engine that had a standard type of wet multiplate clutch, and I think the engine was said to pump out around the 28 horsepower mark, although that particular figure could vary depending on who you actually talk to. But it was just a fantastic motor that even for a relatively small 250 was very light and very powerful. But you can see that Andy's Honda here isn't original, because it has this replacement alloy swing arm to what would have been a tubular steel part back in 1974. And once more you can see more upgrades on Andy's 250 by fitting these very good quality Maxton suspension units, which once again would have replaced what would have been just a simple pair of basic dampers in 74, but as far as I know it's still the same Honda forks on the front of Andy's bike, which even for the early 1970s still worked very well on this bike. But of course nowadays there are many more tweaks and tuning adjustments that you can do to improve these forks' performance on the track. But once more, a lovely example of one of these iconic Elsinores that have so much history and a huge legacy behind them. And as I mentioned, not only is this quite a nice machine to look at, it's equally as quick, as you're soon to find out when the racing highlights are all posted. So certainly look out for Andy Hinchcliffe on both his twin port CZ and this lovely 250 Honda as well. Okay, so just to conclude our part 2 walkabout around the Helsington Race Paddock 2023, we're going to finish off with this lovely 360 or maybe even 380 CZ twin shock bike. Now, as to the actual owner of this bike, I just haven't the foggiest, although the rider's number was listed down to Alan Mullins in the race programme, but Alan was also listed as riding a BSA B50 and a Myco 400, which of course is neither of those bikes, but it's still quite a nice machine though, but from which year I'm not entirely sure. Probably maybe an early 1970s model or thereabouts. And this particular engine here is one of the very few older CZs that haven't had the now popular gear shifter upgrade done, which almost eliminates that long throw that you get when you're shifting with these CZ transmissions. And again, because these were single cylinder CZ motors, they were pretty good power plants. They can often be a little bit rattly when they first start up, which is quite common with many other two-stroke race bikes, but usually after they've been running for a few minutes and then cleaned themselves out, normally these are quite smooth runners with plenty of grunt. And as we continue to move along at the back end of the bike, this exhaust expansion chamber is almost certainly one of these repo production pipes that they're now making in the Czech Republic to replace what would have been the CZ original, but that unmistakable CZ alloy gas tank there with its traditional 1970s shape that was a bit of a trademark for these CZs of its time. But once again, another very nice looking Czechoslovakian stroker, and one of the apparent 170 entries of machines that took part in this Helsington Scramble this year. So as you can work out, in the very few bikes that we've just covered in both of these Paddock videos, you can see that we've only really just scratched the surface of the many machines that were on display. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed having that quick look around the paddock at some of the nice bikes that are soon to take part in this 2023 Helsington Classic Scramble. But of course you can see all of those bikes and many more like them if you simply just subscribe to my CDB TV channel by hitting that subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner of your video player. But until we post that video racing footage, I do hope that you will continue to come back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. But from all of us here at Kendal, for the time being, it's goodbye for now.